Tonight, this is wonderful. Shortly after I started in January, Pam Varkony was gracious enough to host one of our series, the Inside Journalism series, and it was my first exposure to this wonderful lady. Pam comes to us as a writer, a speaker, inspired audiences from America to Australia. This is all in your program, but it just needs to be said. Her passion for improving the lives of others, her insights in life, leadership, politics, and the human condition are all over her resume. But most importantly, she is the proud recipient of the Pearl S. Buck International Women of Influence Award. So, your moderator, and you will see why by the end of the evening, and this great panel that she has selected, how wonderful this whole Inside Journalism series is. It was created to honor Brenda Knowles, and it continues to honor Brenda Knowles. It was a project that was started, and as she was part of the Observer and the Women's Club, the Ruskin Women's Club, decided to do that. So we are looking for an underwriter for this event so that we can continue it into the future. So if you know anyone who is passionate about journalism and wants to underwrite a program, have them call me. Pam? All right.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I know that coming out in the time of COVID takes a certain amount of spunk, as they used to say, and we appreciate you being here. Want to thank you as our live audience, and we also want to thank you, our virtual audience. I understand that we have quite a few people logged on tonight from different parts of the country, not just Florida, so that is very encouraging. Our title tonight is, as Chris explained, this is a series called Inside Journalism, and every time we do it, it's titled Inside Journalism ... something, a subset of that. And tonight, it's Inside Journalism, Will Democracy Stand? And I know that sounds like kind of a dramatic question, but several days ago, the New York Times ran a piece headlined, and I'm slightly paraphrasing here, "Both candidates say they're fighting for America's soul. What does that mean?" And the sub-headline was, "Has this election taken on the importance of a fight for the soul of the nation?" That's a pretty serious question. So no less than Socrates, upon whose wisdom so much of our democratic principles are based, explored the connection between the individual soul and the collective republic in creating and maintaining the concept of justice as a country's founding virtue. For those of us who remember the 60s, we've likely asked that question and searched the soul of the nation before. We've seen turbulent times when the country was stridently divided. I remember watching part of Los Angeles burn to the ground. I remember seeing college students at the other end of a National Guard rifle and wondering if we would ever come together again. And we did. We healed those wounds and went on to become even more prosperous and even more of a world leader. Amid these lofty questions of the soul, the argument could be made that this election has become more about personality and morality than about policy or ideology. Solid policy discussions seem to be in the background, yet it is policy and ideology upon which this country will rise or fall for the coming 4 years. As one longtime political observer said to me when I considered dipping my own toe in the political pool, just make sure the water and the sewer lines stay open and the potholes are filled. An oversimplification, to be sure, but wise words that are at the core of what we expect from our government. Keep us safe, keep the economy stable, and keep the lights on. So in the midst of all that is swirling around us, the Firehouse Cultural Center is very pleased to provide this opportunity for an open discussion of the issues, policies, and personalities surrounding this election. We will begin with a moderated conversation with our panel for approximately 50 minutes, and we will then switch over to an open mic Q&A from the audience. I would like to begin by introducing our panel. We are very pleased to have this panel with us tonight, especially less than 2 weeks out from an election, because they are all involved in one way or another. Barry Edwards, a political consultant and strategist and former finance and trustee director of the Florida Democratic Party. He is also a veteran of several high-profile statewide races, working for both the Florida House and Senate Victory Caucus. Education Commissioner Betty Castor, Congressman Dan Mica, Congresswoman Lois Frankel, and the Clinton 96 re-election campaign. Barry is a frequent lecturer and has taught applied politics and issue advocacy in universities across the country. He has accrued extensive policy experience as an aide to Senator Gene Malkin, who wrote the first Clean Air Indoor Act and Florida's first Right to Know law, both of which became legislative models across the country. Rob Lorai is the well-known host and managing editor of PBS station WEDU's Florida This Week, Tampa Bay's longest-running primetime public affairs program. As moderator, Rob leads a diverse roundtable of journalists, academics, officials, and other political insiders for lively conversations. Under his leadership, Florida This Week has been nominated for 4 Suncoast Emmy Awards. Rob also serves as News and Public Affairs Director at Tampa Bay's member-sponsored community radio station, WMNF. Nick Hansen is the founder of Poly Solutions Consulting, which focuses on political consulting, real estate development, and corporate operations. Nick has spent the past 16 years managing political and government affairs campaigns in Florida, including mayoral races in St. Petersburg and Pensacola, county races, 20-plus state legislative campaigns, congressional races, and presidential campaigns in Florida for Rick Perry and Mitt Romney. Nick currently serves as chairman of Make It Legal Florida, a political committee pushing for Florida constitutional amendment for the adult use of cannabis. And last but far from least, usually ladies go first, but the way they were positioned tonight, April Schiff is the Hillsborough Republican State Committee woman-elect and president and co-founder of Strategic Solutions of Florida, a political consulting firm with a record of winning campaigns, developing strategy, and delivering grassroots implementation. April possesses over 30 years of business management, political consulting, association leadership, and public speaking experience with a proven ability to motivate volunteers, organize groups, and achieve results. April has been a member of the Hillsborough Republican Executive Committee since 1998, serving in many leadership roles. Please welcome our panel. I want to begin by asking each of you to tell us, when you heard the title of tonight's program, Will Democracy Stand? What was your first thought, and how would you answer that question? April, we're going to start with you since you were introduced last.
Thank you very much, Pam, and thanks for having us here tonight. When I heard the title, the first thing I thought about was the November election that is coming before us, and what a great responsibility we all have in choosing our leaders across the board, from the national presidential election, congressional elections, Senate, and all the way down to your local elections, because it's extremely important that we do this and that we vote and make our choices, informed choices. I think that this election, more so than any in the past, because of the extenuating circumstances of the COVID pandemic, what drove the economy down in a nosedive when we all went into seclusion in March to preserve lives, has created an atmosphere that we haven't seen in a presidential election in a long time, between the peaceful protesters, the organized riots, the looting, the canvassing, and I think that the choices that we make in November are going to have a profound effect on what this country looks like going forward. I believe that it's going to be different no matter which candidate wins, but I also believe that as we move forward in the process, it's going to look very different than it does today.
Thank you, April. Okay, Nick?
I had several thoughts. Mine really go back 20 years, and I look at what's happened in the last 20 years in our democracy. And I think the most dangerous thing is actually intertwined with the other part of tonight, which is journalism and the Fourth Estate. I look at it and say, in the last 20 years, half of this country has chosen to delegitimize the president, whether it's Democrat or Republican. If you think about going back to the 2000 election, when we really started to say that that wasn't our president. And if you think back in time, that's not something we said as Americans. We may not have liked the choice. We may have even rioted against the choice. We may have even been very upset with the choice and had those who left office in disgrace. You could look at Richard Nixon as a prime modern example. But we didn't delegitimize the vote. We didn't say that person didn't win. It wasn't fair. And when we look back to the 2000 contested election, and we look back to Barack Obama's historic 2008 election, and we look to Donald Trump's 2016 surprise election, there's a commonality that was said by half of the country, which is, that's not my president. And every subsequent election since then has been sort of rooted in this delegitimizing of the president, of the party in power. And I think that's toxic and corrosive for our democracy and our republic. We can have disagreements. We can have vehement, polarizing disagreements. But when we start to say that the vote doesn't mean anything, and that our vote isn't sacred, and that it doesn't count, or the 24 hours after the ballot box closes, we can run to the streets and claim delegitimizing somebody, I think it's corrosive. And I think it doesn't serve our republic well. And then I thought about what you said about journalism, and I thought, that's probably the most powerful tool we have in this country to right that wrong and to bring people back together. And quite frankly, both parties on all sides have chosen a way to demonize the media, to use it to their gain, to manipulate and cajole, which has always been a part of America. You go back to muckraking and yellow journalism. This is not new. But it's gotten to a level now where it's all consuming. It's always in front of us. It never stops. And when our lives, when our elections become so consequential in our lives, I actually have said this in the last couple of years, I wish our elections were less consequential in our lives. Because the things that bind us as a republic and as a democracy and as Americans, we have become further and further away from those bedrock cornerstone principles that bind us. We can disagree on policy, but we've forgotten what made us who we are as a group. And so when I think about what the topic, can we save this democracy, and how journalism sort of intertwines with that, I actually think the cure, or maybe the vaccine, for what we see in this country is a healthy fourth estate that probably has some things to work on its own, but that we in this society should be able to gather that information more clearly, but also be able to talk to each other and feel like our voices are heard. But I really go back to, are we going to really believe whoever wins this election in 2 weeks is our president? Can we stand up as a nation united and say, whether it's Donald Trump or Vice President Biden, that that's our president? And I've yet to hear us say that as a country, really, truly, since 2000. And I'm praying, that's my prayer, no matter who wins, that we as Americans can say, that's our president, at least for the next 4 years.
Rob?
Well, Pamela, thanks for inviting all of us tonight. And let me start with a story, and that is that we get hit by hurricanes all the time, or we get close brushes with hurricanes all the time. My mom lives, and she's still alive, she lives in Pennsylvania, and President Trump is in my hometown tonight. And my mom will call me up almost like clockwork and say, Rob, how are you? Are you okay? Have you been hit by the hurricane? I said, no, Mom, we're fine. I said, why do you think we were hit by the hurricane? She says, well, every time I see a picture of Florida, I see destruction and death, and I see winds blowing and reporters being blown away by heavy tides. And I say, Mom, we're fine. Tampa's great. The hurricane hit up in the Panhandle, and everything's good. And I think part of the problem with the media is that we tend to blow things out of proportion. We want to go where the fire is. We want to go where the shooting is. We want to go where the most controversial person is. So when the question is our democracy safe, I think by and large, most people think that they're going to accept the results of the election. I truly believe that. I think that most people in the U.S. deep down believe in our democratic republic. But there are going to be some people out there. I mean, we saw with the governor of Michigan just a few days ago. There's some people that wanted to kidnap her and put her on trial. The Wichita mayor had a similar event just in the last few days. I was at the last rally that President Trump did here in Tampa, the last full tilt rally, and there were 10,000 people there. It was at the Florida State Fairgrounds. And I was there at the beginning of the rally, and there were all these QAnon people here. This is about 2 or 3 years ago. And I was talking to QAnon people, and they said, you really got to get hip to this theory. You got to watch the videos and all that. And Jim Acosta from CNN was there. And he was trying to do a stand-up. It was about 6:30. So he's trying to talk to Wolf Blitzer or somebody up there in Atlanta or D.C. And the crowd was screaming, fake news, fake news, fake news. Well, CNN ran with that story. And there were about 500 people screaming fake news. And I thought, well, Jim Acosta's in real danger. But most of the crowd didn't join in. I think a lot of the crowd doesn't like CNN, or didn't like CNN at the time. But I think we in the media tend to take a telescope out. And my daughter lives in Los Angeles, and I said, Maria, is there a fire there near you? She says, no. This is just a few days ago. We tend to take a telescope, we look at that picture in the corner, and we say that represents the entire situation at the firehouse. Well, that doesn't represent the entire situation at the firehouse. And we in the media, and I include myself, we have to take a wider view of what's going on. Most Americans, I think, buy into the democratic process. Most Americans don't want to kidnap the governor of Michigan. And most Americans don't scream at Jim Acosta and say fake news. So I say we're going to be okay. But just remember, the media is a telescope, it's a microscope, and it doesn't give you that panoramic picture.
Thank you, Rob. Barry?
I agree with my three distinguished colleagues. I do conservative talk radio on AM 1040. And today I had Charlie Crist on. And one of the big themes that he wanted to push for was civility. And whether you like his policies, I mean, he's been a flip-flopper. He's always been civil and had a ability to have a discourse. And one of the things we talked about was we have one set of facts. There are one set of facts on the riots, on killing a George Floyd, whatever, killing a Michael Brown. But there's almost two conversations about it. And so the conversations are usually parallel on the same set of facts. And the media, a lot of the reasons why we think there's problems with democracy is the media. I looked at the Tampa Bay Times. I used to be on the board of Pointer. And it said House candidate bails on House District 62, I think. Jamie Grant they were talking about. Will this cost the Republican seat? Well, the word bail is a pejorative word. It's a divisive word. And when I look back in the papers 10, 20 years ago online, they didn't use words like that on straight news stories. So a lot of the reasons why we think there's a problem in democracy is because of the words and the conversation that we're having. And with the 24/7 news cycle, there's a rush to judgment. George Floyd was murdered. His people should go to jail. I think the police on that, the facts are pretty clear. Michael Brown, not so much. I mean, the Attorney General did 2 full forensic audits of how he was killed, and they came out that he was not running with his hands down or up. He was running with his hands down. He had shot himself. He had accosted an Asian person. And the facts, when you read all the police reports and the forensics, which the Justice Department spent hundreds of thousands of dollars hoping to find something, exonerated the police officer. And yet, when MSNBC was there with Chris Hayes saying that they were mostly peaceful, his cameraman had to leave because they were being pelted with rocks by these mostly peaceful protesters. So the media wants to, so they're like talking about the telescope, thought they was mostly peaceful. They weren't mostly peaceful. I was downtown in St. Petersburg, and I came off the interstate, and there was a riot, and they were shooting guns. And I called the police, and the police moved. The police chief had the people over at the city hall, or the police station rather, and he moved them right over 2 blocks away, and they got it settled. So just how we use our word choices, as like Rob, convey a different image. Mostly peaceful. Well, when somebody throws a rock at your head, it's not peaceful. And I grew up in the 60s. I was a kid. My brother's a political scientist, so I studied a lot of that era. My parents were very active in politics. This is not the 60s. Every Saturday, I go walk for at least 40 to 50 houses and knock on people of different parties. And people are overwhelmingly satisfied. It's on both extremes. It's the far right and the far left that think that there's anarchy in America. There's not. There simply isn't. The number of blacks killed by police officers is at an all-time low. It's like 80%, 85% lower than in 1965. And if you do it per capita, cut it in half again. But that's not what you find out. There's like 200 blacks were shot by officers. 80% of those were justified killings. The other 20%, maybe, or 20 or 30 were not. But we hear about them all the time. And now, if you're one of those 30, that's really bad. And we shouldn't have any. But we ought to put things in context. We're a country with 330 million Americans. And our police brutality at its worst day is better than any country anywhere else in the world. And we don't hear that. We don't hear in England, in France. In France, they still have Muslim ghettos. In France, they have a cultural ministry. So in Sweden, they started to pay people to go back to Syria. All these meccas of the left, I don't point to you, I just was pointing back. So America is still the shining city, but we do have one set of facts, 2 conversations, and we need to get back to that. One of the reasons why is when I grew up, we had CBS, and we had NBC, ABC, and PBS. And they all really forced themselves. I think Walter Cronkite was probably more liberal. Tom Brokaw was more conservative, but they did straight news, and they didn't use word choices that were divisive.
Barry, while you're on a roll, I want to switch you over, if I can, to polling, because we have a lot of things I want to cover tonight.
Okay.
Because both you and Nick, particularly during our pre-show interviews, said that you thought polling was really important as it pertained to how people perceive the election and how people are thinking about the candidates, and maybe even will affect the turnout. So let's segue into polling and why you think it's kind of all over the place and why you think it's important for people to understand the difference between it. So can you give me 2 minutes on polling, and then we'll let somebody else talk about it.
So when you see a poll, you need to ask who did it, who paid for it, and is a sample based on history. The New York Times in 2018, after the election, said, boy, pollsters, that what I do, that took the last elections and averaged the last 1 or 2, were far more accurate than people that modeled. Bill Clinton always talked about looking at history. Robbie Mook, who ran Hillary's campaign, came up with all these kooky models that weren't true, and that's why Hillary lost. And polling's important because Andrew Gillum, for instance, when he ran for the nominee, the polls showed him in 3rd or 4th place, and so nobody ever scrutinized his record. Well, then he got the nomination, and all of a sudden we found out that there was all these trips and investigations.
Barry, you want to qualify for who he is, just in case for anybody in the audience who doesn't know.
Andrew Gillum was the mayor of Tallahassee who ran for the Democratic nomination and was the Democratic nominee 2 years ago in Florida. Well, since then, there's been 28 subpoenas served by the FBI that name him as the target of the investigation. But nobody talked about that because they thought that he wasn't going to be the nominee. Plus, he was in a group that we don't like, a minority group. And if you're a woman or an African American or Hispanic, and you're a first one of, the media typically doesn't like to bring out the dirty laundry unless they have to. But because they didn't, he got in, turned out to be a flawed candidate. So if you're a Democrat, you ought to blame the newspapers looking at the polling because they didn't scrutinize him enough, because a lot of people think that if Gwen Graham had been the nominee, she would have won. So polling can trigger you not to scrutinize, but it also gives you the assumption that somebody's going to roll in. And if somebody thinks that there's a winner, and Nick will tell you in this business, that most people in politics give to the person they think are going to win. Not who they really like, but who they think is going to win. So polling can have a lot of nefarious problems if it's not done properly.
I think it's called buying access.
Yes.
Nick?
What I would say about polling is, first, it's a tool. It's an instrument by which to understand voter moods and what messages persuade you. As a political consultant, we use polling not as a horse race. I don't care what the spread is between the D and the R. I don't care what the top of the ticket says when I'm 6 months out from an election or 6 weeks out from an election. What I care about is, what do you care about? The questions I'm probing and asking is, there's a very common misconception that these are push polls when we ask you questions like, would you be more or less likely to vote for Barry Edwards if you knew that he didn't like cats? Right? And which I know Barry loves cats. But my point is, we ask those questions because then that develops how we message to you. Have you ever wondered why we're so good at getting you upset towards the end of an election? It's because we've polled you many, many times, and we've market researched you, and we've followed you online. We know what pushes your buttons, and we're going to spend the money by which to push those buttons to get you into the voting booth for our person. And so when you look at the polls, I think you need to look at them in two very specific ways. One are the public polls that are sort of telling us where we think people are if the vote was today. I would say that those are useful, but not really instructive. And then there are the polls that folks like us use where we ask those questions, and if you drill down into them, they start to, with the crosstab, they start to illuminate where the electorate is at. What do they care about? Are they better off than you were 4 years ago? And I think to tie this into the election today, we're at a very unique place in our history. We have top lines saying to us, my training tells me Joe Biden should win the presidency. Why? Because the polls tell me that he should, right? But the polls told me that Hillary Clinton should have won in 2016. Are they the same? No, they're not. What do we know that's happening today that wasn't happening 4 years ago? And is anything different happening? We have this thing in our minds as humans and as voters to think that the moment in time we exist is the moment in time that will exist 2 weeks from now, 10 days from now, 5 weeks from now, whenever voting happens. But something happens as the deadline approaches. We start to shuffle in our choices, and that's where those questions deep down in that poll start to matriculate up. Because what you say today about who you may vote for changes as the decision point becomes real. And think about in your own life, non-political, as you've made a choice about, I'm going to go save $25,000 this year. By January 1, I'm going to do it. And you get to that point and you go, well, I sort of want to take that cruise instead. And you start to rationalize. We know what those questions are. And they're going to start messing you. I want you to do something for me the next 2 weeks. I want you to pay attention to the political ads. I know you want to shut them off and run away from them and throw your phone into the water and throw your TV into the lake and all those things. But pay attention to those closing messages, because those are the messages that they believe very strongly are going to be the ones that you give your pretext over to want to vote a certain way, whether for Donald Trump or local candidate, whatever it may be. Those are really, really important. I know we're going to talk about polling in the general election now, later, about the sort of the top lines, what I think it is. But in terms of how you should look at pollings is this. It's a great in the wind for the moment in time that you are. But unless you get down into the questions they're asking and really see where people feel about their pocketbook issues or social issues or any of those issues, they're not incredibly helpful for us as Americans to understand where the candidates are going to go. Because they're not making decisions based upon are they 5 points up or 5 points down. They're making decisions about how you feel about all sorts of really important questions. And those are going to be the very important questions that they're going to talk about as you get into your decision point. Because until now, it's all academic until you are close to the point where you're going to make the decision. It's sort of just hitting a moving target all the time. Because we know you as voters are always sort of doing this. And just think about the last 4 years. my good friend Senator Brandis says, things tend to happen slowly and then all at once. And that's what you can see happen in the last couple of elections in a polarized electorate. They happen slowly and then all at once.
Rob or April, do you want to address polling or importance of it?
Well, could I see a show of hands of everybody in this room who has not made up their mind about the presidential election?
Are you willing? Who's willing to admit that they're an undecided? Anybody in here undecided? No, not one single person.
This would be what I call a response bias, because we are in a very specific group here. But yeah, go ahead. Rob, basically.
Yeah, but I do think the polls are very tight right now. If I could, can I say that at this point? One of the most interesting phenomenon on my TV show the last few weeks has been when I get my Republican panel members on, I always ask them, are your members, the members of your party, telling the pollsters the truth? And they say no. They say either they're refusing to answer the poll, or when they answer the poll, they don't answer how they truly feel in their heart. And I think that was part of what went on in 2016 at the presidential level. I'm not talking about down ballot.
Sure.
And there are Republican analysts in this state who would tell you that there's a high number of refusals by Republicans who, when they get that call from a pollster, they say, no, I'm not going to take part. And part of this goes back to the media, because I think that Republicans who support the president think the media includes not just radio and TV like myself or newspapers. They think the media includes pollsters, because that's part of the establishment. So I think pollsters have a really tough time. The way I judge a poll, going back to what Barry said, I want to make sure it's likely voters. I want to make sure that the margin of error is small. If you see a margin of error of 5%, that's way too big. And you want to see a lot of people ask the polling question. So asking 300 people is not a lot of people for any race, even for a mayoral race. You want to see a healthy number. You want to see 800, 1,000, 2,000 people. And if you see a poll, and I've seen polls here in Florida by universities, and I won't name them, but there's a university in South Florida and there's a university in Jacksonville, and they'll poll 400 people and then send out their polling numbers and say, this is how Florida's going to vote. No, that's not how Florida's going to vote when you've only talked to 400 people. So I'm very skeptical of whether or not the pollsters have solved the refusal problem.
I have to agree with pretty much everything that all three of you have said, and you're exactly right. The Republicans are not answering the pollsters' questions, and if they are answering the questions, they are intentionally misleading them, and I know they are doing that. Polling has become less and less reliable as the American public realizes that it's intrusive. I also think that from what I've seen in this presidential election, the Trump supporters, particularly the moderate Republicans that are supporting Trump, are not going to admit it, and they're not calling the silent majority because they're not on the list, because they haven't been voting long enough. So they're not making it to the top of that when we do our targeting for our polling. So I've never seen before so many Republicans that refuse to wear a T-shirt, put a bumper sticker on their car, put a yard sign in their yard, or admit that they're supporting President Trump because of the retaliation. I know people have had their cars keyed, rude comments are made, things of that nature, and to avoid all of that, they just don't do it. So I think that's why we don't see a lot of the public support that we may have seen for the George W. Bushes and those types of people in the past. And it's troubling, but I believe the polls are very misleading. I can tell you, if I wanted to do it, I can get you any answer you want out of a poll. And it's all by who I call, how I call them, when I call them, and what questions I ask them. And I can get the answer that you might want to have, and that's not accurate, and that's why you have organizations that are coming back with things that they're just not accurate. So I think the polls are not very telling at this point.
Can I give you 30 seconds? There's a good example. I'll be real quick. So Alan Cohn and Scott Franklin are running, and the Cohn campaign released a poll, and they said he was leading. Well, I finally got a copy of it. In the head-to-head, we say we vote for Democrat Alan Cohn, a Republican, Scott Franklin was 49-42. They had released it was 48-47 because after that they asked 10 questions. If you knew that Scott Franklin beat his wife every day, 5 ways, and if you knew that Alan Cohn was the resurrection of Christ, would you vote for, then who would you vote for? And that brought it up. But that presupposes that the opponent's not going to do anything. And so those bio polls, I think, are kind of useless at this point.
What Barry's referring to is message testing, which is what we do, which we sort of referred to, and we do that. We ask it at the top of it, and then we see what works.
Right.
What drives that voter to change their preference by the end of the survey. And people will go, oh, I got push polled because they said so many bad things about my guy, Scott Franklin. And we'll say, no, we wanted to see what was going to work, good and bad. And that's exactly what happens. I would be very weary of public polls for all the reasons April said. And because people have gotten smarter. I use this example, if I wouldn't mind, can I use my M&M example? My M&M example is, if you're going to believe that the polls are incorrect, to April's point and premise, is this. Imagine, if you will, you had 100 M&Ms in a bowl. 90 are brown and 10 are green. And the 90 that are brown, they're all Republicans. They all represent a Republican. And the 90 brown M&Ms are Trump supporters. Whether they're on fire for Trump or they're just going to vote for him because that's what they do. And the 10 that are green are Republicans who are not going to vote for Donald Trump. And I'm a pollster, and that's my available Republicans I can pull from to ask. I have a set number. But before I start picking the M&Ms out to see what the ratios are, it should be 90% to 10%, right? That should be what I should get. I remove 30 brown M&Ms out of the bowl. I don't throw them away. I don't say they're not going to vote. I just say we're going to put them outside the bowl. They're not there for you to choose. What percentage does that 10 green M&Ms represent now? It was 10%. But now, what does it represent? Right? It's 30% more. So how does that compute? Well, when you do a randomized sample, people say, well, it's not a big deal. Trump must be losing by 10 points. Maybe he's only losing by 5. Wrong. When you change the base level of your turnout model by just that little bit, it doesn't seem like a lot. It can change double digits to the top line like that, which is why it's so difficult to get the right number, to ask the right questions, and I would proffer that there might be a silent majority for Biden. It's not set in stone that a silent majority only exists for Donald Trump.
That's true.
I think if you're going to be intellectually honest and consistent with yourself, you have to acknowledge that there could be just as easily a silent majority the other way, that don't want to say anything for all sorts of reasons. Maybe it's Republicans who don't want their Republican friends to know they're voting for Joe Biden. And I think that's an important thing. It's an important distinction that we, on the right of center, sort of always think that we're always the persecuted ones. We're always the ones undercounted. We're always the ones never heard from. That may not always be the case. And I think this is going to be an election where there are going to be significant surprises in very specific areas that we have not yet understood how to capture in a traditional poll. So I think we should be very, very leery of that, as people, as April pointed out very astutely, have become much wiser to how polls are used, who's calling them, and for what reasons.
I had an interesting conversation with someone the other day, and they were a Trump supporter, and they said, oh, look, Trump, these people are all going to come out. He's pulling 10,000 people at a rally. You know, Joe Biden's having trouble getting 250 out, and it's just, they're all going to show up, and it's going to be wonderful. But I made the point that everyone that I know that's voting for Biden, they don't go to rallies in T-shirts wearing red hats. They are they're quiet. They stay home. They vote. It's an entirely different voter that's voting for Biden when you compare to the Trump voter who is so enthusiastic they go to a rally. So I agree. I think there could very well be a silent majority for Biden that is not getting counted and is not part of what we're seeing above the surface. We've had such an intense discussion about a couple of subjects. I want to make sure that I cover a few things that I think are really important here before we have to switch over to our Q&A. And that is the fact that we have We have some very important issues on the ballot. We're talking about the presidential election, we're talking about national politics, but I do want to talk about some of the issues that are going to be on the ballot. We have some really important referendums on the ballot, including a $15 minimum wage and whether we're going to become an open primary state. And those are two there's actually other important questions. Those were, I thought, two extremely important to the general public. So let's have a discussion about that $15 minimum wage, and then if we have time, we'll go to open primary. April, you want to kick that off? What do you think about a $15 minimum wage? People are going to get to vote on whether we should have a $15 minimum wage. In Florida, it's going to be on your ballot.
That would be amendment number 2, and it is set up so that the $15 minimum wage phases in. It starts with $1 in 2021, and then it works its way up to $15. It also has some other things in there. And I think that on the surface, it sounds great. Wouldn't it be great if everybody started working at $15 an hour and that's what they were going to make all the time? The problem with it is that it's not good for business, it's not good for the economy, and business cannot sustain a $15 minimum wage. Minimum wages were meant for entry-level jobs into the workplace. Most people who enter at a minimum wage work their way up to a higher wage. If you look at your local restaurants, your local dress shop, where you buy your shoes, any number of businesses that you visit on a regular basis, the bakery, the this, the that, they cannot survive on a $15 minimum wage, and they will shut down. It will be a disaster for our economy, particularly in light of what has just happened with the pandemic and what it has done to our economy. It's coming back. It's going to slowly come back, but every day we're seeing more and more businesses that are closing because the income that they're getting from what used to be crowds is no longer sustaining what they need to pay their employees and to pay their rent and for their goods and services. So the $15 minimum wage at the end of the day is not, in my opinion, a very good thing at all, and it could be very damaging to our state's economy.
Nick?
I think the minimum wage is yet another, we don't have a free market society. We have pretty close, but we have government intervention all the time. We regulate things for safety. We regulate things for fairness, whatever we decide that is. Minimum wage, as April pointed out, was never supposed, a minimum wage job was supposed to be an entry-level job. It was never intended to be something to be a livable wage. You hear that a lot now. We sort of like, we redefine terms all the time now. We just sort of, well, it should be a livable wage. My first job was cleaning racquetball courts and exercise equipment at 14 years old on my birthday. You know, it was my first day in the job. Turned 14 years old, scrubbing racquetball courts and cleaning exercise equipment in a gym. That's what I did. You know, I took a bus, got there, got paid, I think, $10 an hour, $9 an hour, whatever it was back then, because nobody else wanted to clean junky stuff. But capital goes where it's treated best. And look no further than when those who have capital, when they decide that labor is too expensive, what do? They put machines in. They change hours. They cut down their delivery, they cut down their dining room and up their takeout. They do all sorts of things to make money. They're going to find a way around it. Capital will find a way around minimum wage. What that means is less jobs. It absolutely will happen. I have been fortunate enough to sign paychecks to employ people. I've employed hundreds of people. I've employed 2 people. And I can tell you right now, as somebody where I have to look and make the payroll, and there's been weeks where I didn't take my distribution because I wanted to make sure my people, because it's hard to find good work. Anybody who's hired somebody knows that process is awful. I just hired a brand new receptionist after one I had for 2 years just left. And it's tough because she was great. And I had to go through all the resumes and do all the things, and I had to offer a competitive wage. And I wanted somebody whose skills were up. But at the end of the day, don't kid yourself. You can vote for a $15 minimum wage. Why not 20? Why not 25? Why not 30? Because at the end of the day, business will find a way to make money. And if that means less labor, it will be less labor. And the industries that cannot possibly go without less labor will cease to exist. There will be new industries. There will be new products. But don't ever kid yourself. You cannot legislate your way to a livable wage. There is only one way to it, in my opinion, is that you start off at an entry level and you work yourself up. And if you take the entry-level job, that's where you want to be. It's a failing on our part to not coach up our people, to not look for ways for folks to get out of the entry level. But what are we saying to people to say, well, that could be a livable wage if you wanted to work at McDonald's the rest of your life, and nothing against anybody working at McDonald's and working their way up, but that was never intended to be a livable wage. It was never intended to be a career. What are we saying to our youth? What are we saying to Americans when we say that is the job that you can be in forever? Because we'll just keep raising it legislatively. Do they not want more? Can we not offer more? And I think that's where we need to look inward and say, we've lost sight of what these jobs really mean for people. They should be a source of pride to build upon to go to the next level, not something they should be stuck in by which to protest to give themselves raises. Because that, I think, is just a completely backwards motivation and stimulation for growth and for a well society where people value their work and their labor.
Rob?
Wow. Wow. So, does anybody here know who Mark Wilson is? Who's I think he's the vice president of the Florida Chamber of Commerce.
He's still a Florida Chamber, right?
Yeah,
Mark,
yeah.
Yeah.
I interviewed Mark Wilson about this topic about 10 years ago, because 10 years ago on the ballot here in Florida, we asked Florida voters whether or not they wanted to raise the minimum wage. And Florida voters overwhelmingly passed that minimum wage raise 10 years ago. Mark Wilson said everything that Nick just said here, that we would lose jobs. We didn't lose jobs. Our minimum wage is higher than the national average or national minimum wage. We didn't lose jobs. We didn't see kids going unemployed. I hear this argument over and over again, and let me give you some background. I think Donald Trump won because the Democrats lost the working class. And let me tell you how bad it is here in Florida. You all know that radical organization, the United Way? Really left-wing organization. Can't trust them, bunch of Marxists. Well, every 2 years they put out a study. It's called the Alice Study. And it counts the number of working poor in Florida. And it counts the number of working poor here in Hillsborough County. And I just happen to bring part of the study here, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but we have 7.8 million households here in Florida. 7.8 million. Do you know what percentage of those households can't pay for an emergency of $400 or more at the end of the month? What percent? Does anybody have a guess? 50? No, but 30%. And that number's gone up every year, including under the first 2 years of the Trump administration. It's so bad, actually it's 33%. It's so bad that in Hillsborough County, 29% of the people don't make enough to get through a household emergency. In Pasco County, it's 35%. In Pinellas County, it's 33%. Hardy County, it's 41%. In Manatee County, it's 32%. Sarasota, 30%. Polk County, 33%. Do you know what percent of kids in public schools qualify for subsidized breakfast and lunch?
62% in Hillsborough.
It's close to 62% in Hillsborough. Most counties, it's around 50 or 55% in this area. And the Alice study looks at people that work for a living. The poverty rate is an additional 10% above that. So you've got 33% who are working poor here in Florida, and you've got 10% in poverty. You're almost up to half of the population make so little money they can't get by here in Florida. And what the radical group, the United Way, found was that if you have a 4-person family, 2 kids, 2 parents, and you want to just break even at the end of the month, those 2 parents would need to earn $17.38 an hour in order to pay for the 2 kids, the car, the house, the child care, the food, the electricity. So if we take 6 years to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, we're still, 6 years from now, we're still going to be behind And we're still going to have an enormous amount of working poor and people in poverty living here in Florida.
Barry, you're on.
So I kind of split the difference between the two. Ideologically, philosophically, I'm for raising the minimum wage. However, I think that my two friends on the right here are correct. I supported the minimum wage. In fact, I argued with Mr. Hansen's partner when it was 10 years ago. It was a smaller initial raise, and I didn't think that we'd have inflation. I didn't think we'd have job loss. This is a much larger raise. This is a 50% increase in a short period of time where we have zero inflation. I mean, we have 1.5%, 2% inflation. So it's a much larger raise. We have seen a loss of summer jobs because of this. So we haven't seen unemployment because we become more efficient overall. But the summer jobs that kids used to have, that Nick's kids are going to be coming into the system, don't exist anymore because of increased wages. And automation. I met with Blake Casper a couple years ago. And if you go to McDonald's, where they had the big protest and the shooting, I think where they caught the serial killer, McDonald's parking lots are a place to hang out for a lot of people, I guess. He eliminated a couple dozen employees by adding kiosks where you go make your order. Now, I like to talk to people. I used to go to the 4th Street and 38th Avenue McDonald's, and the same woman waited on her, and at Christmas I would bring her a big Godiva chocolate package. She doesn't work there anymore. They eliminated all those people. They have 3 or 4 people taking orders, and we do them on an automated, and it changed to me, the whole ambiance of going to McDonald's. So automation is a threat that we didn't have 10 years ago. Large corporations already have the minimum wage. Amazon pays at least $15 an hour to everybody because we have a labor shortage in America. And whether it's all due to Donald Trump or whatever, but we had more people enter the workforce the last 4 years than we've had in 40 years. We had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. These are facts. Now, why, is all the president to do it? Probably not. And he was given factually a strong economy that was growing, alibi not as fast as it did under him. But he also stimulated it with the tax cut. So Amazon pays that because there's a shortage of labor. We had canvassing at Casa Biden this last weekend in Tampa, which is the big place where the Democrats go out for Joe Biden. We couldn't pay $15 an hour. We paid $18. You know how many people we had show up at $18 an hour to canvass when it's 82 degrees and 50% humidity in the fall in Florida? We had 2 high school kids. I didn't know what to do. I mean, they were 17.
It's terrible. Barry and I, we go through this. How many races have we done together or been on opposite sides? It's unreal. You can't pay people $20 an hour to knock on doors or make phone calls.
And I was shocked because I didn't know what to do with 2 17-year-olds. I was worried that, something might happen to them. They're probably more capable of handling themselves than I am. But other people, they just wouldn't even come out for $18 an hour. And that's the problem of affluence. And
I haven't had that problem because I have been able to hire walkers and phone callers, but I'm hitting the college students really heavy. So
Yeah,
they're taking it.
I will say, and
I haven't had that
Rob made great points, and I appreciate you doing that because I think it's more nuanced than no raising the minimum wage. And I think my ultimate supposition is that I think capital finds a way, and hopefully that finds its way to labor, but it takes a lot of retooling. The problem is, you have a society right now whose standard of living, even at the poverty level, is so drastically different. It is not to make light of people living in poverty. Trust me when I tell you that I have had the privilege to be able to serve and to grow up what I would say fairly humble as the youngest of 3 in a split household with my mom working 3 jobs. And I can tell you that you don't know when you're sort of working poor until you're not working poor. I sort of, when I married my wife, who had a lot more money than I did, I said, what do you mean you had cable? I didn't have cable until I was 17 years old. I had a non-working TV on top of a working TV, and we used tinfoil to get 4 channels, and that's what I did. And I didn't know any different, and it helped me. But I think that story is probably not the same for lots of folks who come here who may be first generation from South America or Central America. It may not be the same story for somebody, who doesn't have a 2-parent household. I could go on my soapbox forever, but I will say this. When you look at people, what they are willing to do for the money you will pay, it blows me away that there is such a lack of appreciation for a real wage, even when you're offering above minimum wage, $20, $18 an hour, because there is, in this society, as there has always been, but it has grown, this complacency, this entitlement, this, well, what do you mean I have to do that?
But these are part-time
These are
jobs.
part-time, but even
This is
full-time.
not a career, this is a
No, but
part-time.
full-time job, no, I would make the argument, I mean, I just got done interviewing 20 people for a position that starting pay is $15 an hour for a full-time position at a desk where you get to watch television when you're not answering phones.
Okay, I feel like I should jump in. Just
No,
one-
but I
one more story.
think the working poor is different. I think
One more
Rob,
story.
Rob,
I'm
you're
gonna
gonna,
bolster. I
Rob, you're
think-
gonna have to jump in quickly, because
Okay.
we're gonna have to wrap it
That the
up.
government, there's a better way to do this, and we always look at either ors. I think that Florida should expand, the Republicans, I think, are lacking in that if we say we support the working poor, then we ought to support the working poor. If somebody's working 40 hours a week, we ought to have an opportunity for them to have basic health care. We should expand Medicaid. So people right now, either you get Medicaid if you don't work, or you get to do Obamacare. If you do work, you make over 30-some thousand. But there's that donut. We should fill that donut, and I think that would help a lot to help take pressure off people that are working. But also, we could do the earned income credit, and because it's like what Nick said, the small businesses that can't automate. The Tampa Bay Times, for God's sake, came out against Amendment 2 because they can't automate. They don't pay their staff that much. They would have to lay people off. So I turn it over to Rob.
No, I'll pass, unless people really want to hear it.
I do.
do.
Okay, so real quickly, during this same debate where Mark Wilson is going around the state from the Chamber of Commerce arguing against the $1 increase in the minimum wage 10 years ago, Stephen Greenhouse, the labor reporter for the New York Times, went over to Denmark and he came to Tampa. And in Tampa, he met a guy that worked at the Burger King, and he also worked at the McDonald's. And the guy had 2 kids. So the guy was paid whatever the minimum wage was 10 years ago, and he had to take the bus. And he had 2 shifts. He had a 4-hour shift at the McDonald's, and he had a 4-hour shift at the Burger King. And this is how he put his work schedule together. He had no car. He had no child care that he could afford. Occasionally, he had enough money that he could pay a daycare place, but most of the time, he left the kids with a relative. And this guy was paid whatever, I'm guessing it was probably $7 or $6 an hour. Stephen Greenhouse found this in Tampa. This guy was destitute, completely destitute. So Greenhouse goes over to Denmark, and he goes to the Burger King in Denmark, and he goes to the McDonald's in Denmark, where the Big Mac costs 50 cents more in Denmark, and this is 10 years ago. So, okay, 50 cents is a lot of money. The guy had $20 an hour wage. He had a vacation. He had health care. He had a pension plan. And he was planning to get out of this work because he didn't want to. He was in his early 20s. He's planning not to work at the McDonald's and the Burger King forever, but he was using this as a stepping stone. And in this case, society didn't have its thumb down on this guy because this guy was on his way to better things because he had a social safety net in Denmark. It's something that we don't have here. And we wonder why. Anybody volunteer for guarding ad litem here? We wonder why there's so many abused kids in Hillsborough County. Go down to the courthouse sometime and watch some of these cases of abused kids in broken families where the parents have to work 2 jobs, they're never there. We have a whole host of problems in our country that we don't deal with that other countries don't have. It's because we're not farsighted enough to say the problems begin with poverty. Most problems in our country begin with poverty. The guy that's breaking into your house at night, the guy that's, robbing the bank and all that, it's poverty. And we never have a discussion about how to solve that problem. And we got to, otherwise we're never going to get better.
I want to, we are over our time limit, but I just think the next issue is so important. I really just basically want to survey the 4 panel, not ask for a lot of statements, just kind of a sentence or 2 about how you feel about it, about Florida becoming an open primary state where anyone, no matter what party you're registered to, could vote in the primary election. Right now, we're a closed primary state. You can, if you're a Republican, you vote in the Republican primary. You're Democrat, you vote in the Democrat primary. If you're an independent or undeclared, you can't vote. So there is an amendment to change that on this upcoming ballot, and it would be an open primary. You could vote in any party, no matter how you are registered. April?
The open primary, the amendment is bad for Florida. You can now vote any way you want in a primary. You just go change your registration. If you want to participate in the Democratic primary, go change it to a Democrat. If you want to participate in the Republican primary, go change it to a Republican. You could change it back the day after to whatever you want it to be. The people that are registered with no party affiliation still have the ability to vote on the nonpartisan races, the judges, a lot of city councils, school boards, things of that nature. And it's different in every county in the state. Some of them can also vote for constitutional officers because those are not partisan races. This will change the face of our state as we know it. You will see, if this happens and it passes, you will see races across the board where no matter who's in the primary, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, top 2 voters come out of there and go to the general election. Could be 2 Republicans, it could be 2 Democrats. The purpose of the primary to begin with in the state of Florida is for the political party to choose their nominee to run for election in the general election. So if you want to participate in that, you just have to change your registration and carry on.
Okay. Nick?
I'm against them reflexively just because of my background, but I'm also, I think it leaves a lot open. You look at other states, there's a lot of gamesmanship that goes on in these, what they call them jungle primaries, open primaries, where you sort of game the system. And then what functionally ends up happening is typically the most conservative and the most liberal tend to be the 1 and 2 that come out of the primary. And how does that happen? Well, they get a bunch of patsies to run Republicans and a bunch of patsies to run Democrats, and they siphon off votes and they play all these games. You see it happening in Georgia right now. It's just gamesmanship, and I think the intent is well. I think the intent is good. I think the idea there is to get people who are, I don't want to say moderate, but sort of have a broad spectrum of beliefs, and I think that is laudable. And I would seek other ways to get there. Heck, get rid of primaries altogether. You just have a general election. Just run. There is no nominee. If you're really going to go to that point, that's what you're effectively saying. So I don't support it. I don't think it's good. I think functionally it will end up having the same, within 90% the same outcomes you probably would have had. Obviously there's some, obviously different, but what ends up happening is you get a bunch of current political consultants who will get a bunch of people to file with a bunch of names. You'll have a primary that'll have 15 people's names on it, and you're going to end up still voting for the person who probably had the most money with the most sort of geographical base, who is the most partisan. That's just what's functionally will happen 9 times out of 10.
Rob?
I agree with both of you. I think you're right on. What's weird to me, and are there lawyers in this room? The Florida Supreme Court says that there can only be, in a constitutional amendment, 1 issue. You can only address 1 issue. What they're doing with this amendment is they're creating 2 issues. One is a good one, one is a bad one. The first issue is let everybody vote in the primaries. If you choose to be a Republican for that election, you can vote in the Republican primary and help choose the standard bearer of the party. But in addition to allowing that, this amendment allows what April just said, and that is the top 2 vote getters. So in California, what you have is the top 2 vote getters oftentimes are 2 Democrats. So if you're a Republican out in California, you're all angry because you don't have a choice. You got a choice between a moderate Democrat and a super liberal Democrat. And I don't know for the life of me how the Florida Supreme Court, which says you can only address 1 issue in an amendment, allowed these 2 issues to be on the same amendment.
That happens on amendments all the time. And I don't know how they get past the test, but consistently, look at the amendment that passed in Hillsborough County for the increase in the tax, for the transportation tax. It's right now pending for that very reason, because it was unconstitutional what they did in the amendment.
Yeah.
Allegedly. We'll see how that outcome is. And they've been collecting the tax since it passed.
As somebody who's waiting for their amendment to be approved by the Florida Supreme Court right now that had oral arguments back in May, I wholeheartedly endorse that. I don't understand what the Supreme Court does half the time, but yeah, single subject is incredibly important when you're talking about amendments. And Rob, you're right to point that out, that it functionally changes 2 standards. And I will tell you, as someone who's written a constitutional amendment and hopefully will be on the ballot in 2022, at the end of the day, it is already set up to be a high standard by which to get there. And so when you are changing multiple things, I think voters should have reasonable access to their Constitution, but I believe the Constitution is a document, whether the state level.
Barry,
I'll
you
be
get,
quick.
you get the final word.
So the whole concept of the jungle primary was to try to solve a problem we have in Florida where we've become more partisan. The Republicans in the legislature are more conservative than they were 10 and 20 years ago. The Democrats are far more liberal than they were 20 years ago. We used to have a runoff. So in California, they have the jungle primary, and it didn't result. Sean Shaw's group is saying that it's going to get rid of blacks. There's no mathematical evidence for that when you actually look at the long term. He uses Andrew Gillum, which is a one-off, and that's because the Republicans thought that Adam Putnam was going to be the nominee, so nobody ran until Ron DeSantis got in. The Democrats had a competitive primary, and so if you look at California, what it did do is there were 17, I had Kevin McCarthy on my show, the minority leader in the House a couple months ago. They had 17 congressmen before jungle primaries in Florida and California. Now they have 8. So it wiped out the Republican Party. It didn't do anything with racial mix-up, matchups, or things like that. But we used to have the runoff. In Florida, our great leaders that we look back at. Reuben Askew came in second in his primary. Lawton Childs came in second in his primary. Bob Graham came in second in his primary. And then they went on to win because they were able to forge a larger coalition, and it brought people toward the middle. That's the intent. But we got rid of runoffs in Florida because we wanted to do something to make voting more convenient. So that's why you have to think about intents. Number one, the Republicans thought Florida's a center-right state, so if you had to default between a loony righty and a loony lefty, you go with a loony righty, which is what happened. But the runoff was the first Tuesday in October, the primary the first Tuesday in September, and then the general the first Tuesday in November. But by expanding mail voting to make it no excuse mail voting, you now get your ballot, 49 days out? You can't have a runoff. So all this convenience, we want all these rights as voters, but we gave up the right to have people that really represented the core of the middle because we want to be able to take 2 months. As I say on my radio show, I don't want you to go to the grocery store and be squeezing the cantaloupe while you're voting. I think we need to have some responsibility and some time spent to support democracy. That's my comments.
I endorse that.
That is a wonderful way to wrap up this segment. I do want to thank you all for a very insightful conversation. We are now going to open the floor for audience Q&A. And I want to say that we do have an expectation of a polite and civil discourse. I have done this several times here. Did I hear somebody laughing? We have done this multiple times here, and I have moderated multiple times, and we have never had anything but a very polite, civil, respectful audience, and we have no reason to expect that that will not continue. So we are going to open the floors. Beth, how are we going to do it? People are going to come back to you. If you want to ask a question of the panel, please get up and go back to Beth in the back of the room, who will have the microphone in her hand so the panel can hear you. Who wants to ask a question of the panel? Oh, it's going to be an early evening tonight.
We answered everything.
Come on, you got to have
we
some
solved
questions.
the world's problems in less than 49 minutes. I feel pretty good about myself.
This is such a great panel. You must have a question for them.
I drove across the Skyway.
Hey,
You got to
listen.
ask me at least one question.
First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion, and you all made some very, very good points, and it's been very insightful. My question, it's not really a question. In my conversations with friends, can you hold up just a little bit higher? We often talk about why people are voting for Trump or why they're voting for Biden, and it's a question of socialism. They say we don't want our country to become a socialist country. I think they're confusing socialism with communism, and they don't really know what socialism means. And I wondered how you felt about it and whether you thought the media should maybe focus on it a little bit and clear up the confusion. Thank you very much.
Okay, who wants to start with that?
I'll start. I think that the big problem for Democrats, and I just saw polls in South Florida, is you're right. There is a confusion between communism and socialism. The communism would be the authoritarian part or totalitarian part like we're seeing in China. But the socialism part is the Democratic Party has a very loud vocal group. The Bernie people, I hope if you're a Bernie people, I like Bernie people, and the Alexander Ocasio people. But they say things like, you know, the chief economic advisor for Bernie Sanders said 4 years ago when he ran the first time that the economic model of the future was Venezuela. And he liked Hugo Chavez. He said it. You know, it's a fact. So he's either got to disown that guy and fire him, or when you go down to South Florida, I did predictions for the Tampa Bay Times a year out, the last Senate race. Everything was within 1.5 points of what it should be because the districts are gerrymandered. Except for in Miami, Manny Diaz got 7.5% more of the vote because the Hispanics that were first generation or second generation, non-Puerto Rican Hispanics from the Caribbean or South and Central America overwhelmingly voted for the Republican because they fled places like Venezuela. So the media needs to clear that, but also the Democratic nominees need to say, you're out of the mainstream, Bernie. You're out of the mainstream, Alexander Ocasio. And that's not Barry Edwards saying that. We have Nancy Pelosi, who I've been to her house with Jeannie Malkin and Betty Castor in 1984, the Democratic Convention when I was a kid that was like Nick's age. She said on 60 Minutes that the squad was irrelevant. She said there's 4 of them. Why do we talk about them? They're irrelevant. They have no power in our caucus. So the Democratic leadership needs to say, we repudiate that. And it's not the media's responsibility. It's Democrats need to say, Bernie, you're out of the mainstream. You're not even a Democrat. And Tom Perez and the chairman before should have said, either you're a Democrat or you're not. Why we let a Democratic socialist run for the Democratic nominee is in the long term going to be very destructive to the Democratic Party.
And there you have it.
Yeah, I think the socialism and all of that is a manifestation of what Rob sort of hit on when he talked about the working class. I think what you're really seeing here is a realignment in our politics. I think you're seeing a realignment of there is the have and the have-nots. And this has been going on since man began, okay? And we are seeing it manifest now. We are no longer moored to these sort of esoteric policy discussions about tax brackets and foreign policy. That's not what animates American people right now. It's not. You have on the left manifesting through Antifa, through socialism, through Bernie Sanders, you're seeing a rise of people who feel that they are not part of Nancy Pelosi's establishment, that they are not part of the caucus, that they are not part of the decision makers, that they do not have a seat at the table. But what's interesting is you are starting to see that coalesce on the right as well. You are starting to see people that are quote-unquote working class. Donald Trump is the worst avatar for a working class person, but he absolutely speaks their language. When I say he's the worst avatar, not because I don't like Donald Trump or don't think he's a good president, it's because he's a billionaire from New York who crashed in the 80s and got bailed out by the banks and came back and was a reality TV star who's had, 3 wives and all this sort of stuff. He is the antithesis of what somebody from that strata would feel is their champion. But think about how thirsty you must be to make that person your champion. And think about it on the left as well as Bernie Sanders is your champion. So what are we really saying here? If you take a step back and strip off the D's and the R's, and you really look at who is yelling right now, we say it's the extremes, but what part of the extremes? It's people who are feeling like they do not have a voice. And for the first time in American politics, well, not the first time in a long time, you're seeing it happen on both sides. And they are manifesting in very specific ways. And I would say the danger is if we continue to ignore them, if we continue to believe we can put a lid on it, if we continue to believe that we can legislate out of it or that our betters can make our decisions for us, whether it be in the media or fossilized sort of folks who've been in Senate for 45 years or 90 years, or if you watch the Amy Coney Barrett, you would see these people should have long since left these seats. But they are controlling the axis of power and those levers. And there will be a revolt, and we have seen it. It failed with Bernie, but it got pretty darn close. It didn't fail with Trump in 2016. And I would wager that if Bernie Sanders had come out of that primary in 2016, I'm not sure you wouldn't have seen Bernie Sanders as president. And I'm going to tell you why. You go look at the crosstabs of the voters who switched and went to Trump at the end, they were very specific about why they did. Because they felt that that guy was going to go into that lever, those halls of power, throw the tables over, mess it all. They knew what they got with Hillary was more of the same. But they knew with Donald Trump, I'm willing to bet on black just this one time. I'm going to roll the dice because I feel that's a better shot for me to break through with him. I don't know if that carries today, 4 years later with a record, but I'm telling you right now, if you want to sound smart to your friends, just keep your eye on those two groups as we move forward over the next 4 years. If Joe Biden, if he is president, has to acknowledge those groups, and that is the motivating factor for those people on the right to vote right now, is they're saying, Joe Biden's not president, AOC is president, the Democratic National Committee is president, the left is the president, and I think that's what scares people on the right. So I really feel like we are heading for a realignment in both of our parties, and you're already seeing it happen right now. But I'm just not sure if it's the end of the continuum or the beginning with this election.
Partially, I don't disagree with what's been said already, but to your question, I firmly believe, having written message to voters for over 20 years, most people don't understand the difference, okay? So it's more of a misunderstanding of what's the difference between socialism and communism. Plus, they both sound bad. If you look at the news, you see in any of those types of countries where they're living a life that's nothing compared to what we have. So if either one of those are taking us to that result, I think it scares people. And that fear is being instilled into voters to try to affect how they vote. There's no question about that.
So I agree a lot with what Nick said. I think this goes back to the telescope. So if you figure there's 535 members of Congress, and you've got the squad, and you've got Bernie Sanders, that's less than 1% of the Congress. Yet Barry got all worked up about Bernie and the squad. If you talk to Kathy Castor, if you talk to Charlie Crist, who are the two local Democrats, they're really moderate. Castor has rejected the Green New Deal. Neither one supports single payer. But keep in mind this word socialism attacking Democrats is not new. So if you go back to FDR, when he instituted a minimum wage Social Security and spoke out loud about health care for all, he was called a traitor to his class, communist, socialist. This is the 1940s. Harry Truman wanted health care for all. He was called a traitor to his class. I can show you the soundbite from John Kennedy, where he said he wants Medicare for all, single payer for all. He didn't say it starts at 65. He said, I want Medicare for all. In that election, well, what would have been the election, I'm sure he would have been attacked. He said this in 62. I'm sure in the 64 election, he would have been called a communist or a socialist. So Democrats have been called communists and socialists going back to the days of FDR. I think where the confusion comes in, and I think the people that try to spin the message, and I think there's a lot of message spinners out there, is they say, oh, Bernie Sanders, he wants Venezuela, or Bernie Sanders, he wants Cuba, where you've got a repressive government, you've got state control of all industries, you've got people making very little money, you might have an okay education system, but nobody in this country wants to live that way. What Bernie is saying is that he wants Sweden, he wants Denmark, he wants Norway, he wants Finland. That's what Bernie's saying. But he gets mischaracterized, and Barry got all aflutter.
I don't think he does get mischaracterized.
No, he doesn't, if you ask Bernie Sanders, he doesn't want to see a repressive government. He wants to see a social safety net.
He wants to have control of state industries. He said it. Not Barry.
Yeah, but,
that's
keep in
essentially-
mind, I mean, you're looking through the telescope. You've got three people. If let's say that the Democrats tried to get single payer, which was a goal of JFK. It was a goal of Harry Truman's.
Richard Nixon wanted universal health coverage paid for by the employer.
Well, I'm saying single payer. You would have to get 51 votes in the Senate. You'd have to get a majority of votes in the House. You'd have to get the president to sign it. There's no way that the squad of 4 people and Bernie Sanders in the U.S. Senate is going to bring you anything near socialism anytime soon, unless there's a grassroots movement to elect to replace Kathy Castor with somebody who's more on the left, to replace Charlie Crist with somebody who's more on the left, to replace Vern Buchanan with somebody who's more on the left. You're not going to do this. So I think there's a lot of scare words going on out there, but I think you got to put the telescope down and look at the big picture.
All right. Next question.
It's, I'm sorry, it's not so much a question, but I'd just like to mention that this evening, just before I left the House, I was actually polled on the phone, asking me so many questions, and it was quite interesting to have been polled and then come here and all of you talking about polling. So as I said, that was quite interesting. And I'd like to make some comments about the various comments made here tonight. And you'll forgive me, I'm not so good with names, but the gentleman from PBS, yes, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name.
Rob.
I would have to agree with you that poverty is probably the most important issue we face here in America. I taught school for over 30 years, and the biggest issue we always had, and it was in Miami, was poverty. And you could see that in the face of the children as they came to school every day, and you could see it after school as well because of the lack of interchange between perhaps the more perhaps between those who were not at that line of poverty and those that were not. There was little interchange. And I'd like to also bring up the question of racism, which was not discussed here tonight at all. And I think that racism has a big issue, a big place in this election. And it's one of the many reasons that I have chosen my own candidate is racism. And I think that it's a very big issue here in America and something we all need to face. And regarding the increase in wages, we forget that as wages increase, so do salaries increase. My first job was in Columbus, Georgia. I earned $1,500. If my ending salary was $1,500, I would be below the poverty line. So I think you need to think about the fact that prices increase as salaries increase, and one kind of really offsets the other. So that you might have a higher salary, but you're paying more for goods and supplies. And I guess that's it.
Can I say something about, Rob, I wanted to say when you brought up poverty, and this is my soapbox. I'm a father of 5, and yeah, God bless you. And so you know what I go through. I got to miss bedtime tonight, which I usually don't like to do, but I'm okay. I was home all day. So I get often asked by candidates and clients, oh, why don't you run? Wouldn't you run one day? Nope, never going to do it. I said, but if I did, I'd run on a single platform. I would say, if you elect me, I will do everything in my power constitutionally to have 2-parent households. I will incentivize through taxes, through every way, shape, or form. I don't care if it's same sex. I don't care if it's husband and wife. I don't care. Because if you look at every study from every group, from left, right, center, is if you have 2 parents in the household, your issues with poverty, with abuse, with drug addiction, with criminality, all of these things, education,
Plummet.
they just fall off the, and I think it's the one place. Forget about the religious overtones. As a Christian conservative, I can tell you I could talk till I'm blue in the face about my faith, but I will join hand in hand with anybody on the left that wants to talk that jive with me and say, if we can put 2 parents in that house, or 2 adults with any foundation, I don't care if their IQs are 160 or 100. I want 2 humans who care about another human to raise that child. And if you can do that, if your focus is that family, I was raised by my mother and father, although they split, they were wonderful people. My dad was very instrumental in my life, and my grandparents were incredibly instrumental in my life. I moved my family across the county to be close to my in-laws so that my kids could have the experience I had, because I was raised by those adults who cared and loved me. A mentor, a teacher can change your life. I think if we want to talk about the things that we can do in this country, it's not going to be another government program. It's not going to be another tax increase. You want the best bang for your buck? The best bang for your buck. Make wise choices with how you plan your family. Stay together. Incentivize people to stay as a family for as long as you can. Forever. You will see the changes in this society. And it's not a Pollyanna back to Newt Rockne and all this. The good old days in the 50s. But think about it. I'm not asking people to go back to being bigots or racist. I'm not asking you to go back and forget all the lessons we've learned. What I'm asking you to do is go, what works? And I can tell you at bedtime every night, my wife right now is praying that I got home in time. And why is that different for everything else in our lives? Picking up and dropping kids to school. You talked about the gentleman who had to take the bus to and from who had 2 kids. I will guarantee you, and my business partner, God bless him, does calls for St. Vincent de Paul's and doesn't tell anybody. He does. Been doing them for 10 years, okay? And he visits these families, and he can tell you every single time we talk about it, it's the same thing. Where's the mom? Where's the dad? Every time. And I think if you ask yourselves, it doesn't mean every kid's going to end up perfect, but I can guarantee you their chances of falling into things that our society spends so much time fighting about fixing would never need to be fixed at the level they need to be fixed at if that kid went home every day and knew he was loved or she was loved and was cared for by whoever those 2 parents are. I think you could, I would endorse every single constitutional program to make that happen. And I would vote for anybody, Democrat or Republican, who spoke like that and just talked about the family and how much that home can change the trajectory of not only the kids' lives, but the parents' lives too. Health outcomes, everything is tied to the family. Everything is tied to that unit family. And I think that's the socialism, the scary left thing we hear about, this breaking down of the nuclear family and how do whatever you want, have how many kids, do whatever you, I think that is a dangerous, and if we can all speak in one voice to say that is a dangerous rhetoric for our policy in America. Because all we're going to do is spend the rest of our lives working to throw money and elections at each other to try to fix a problem that really just requires us to love each other again and to have a family for kids. And I don't care what kind of family it is, just make sure there's adults there. Make sure that they care and love that kid. That could change everything.
To put it in statistical, in the Tampa Bay Times won a Pulitzer for an article about the 5 failure factories. And the 5 failure factories are in my hometown of St. Petersburg. And I got them to write a little additional piece. I got to compare the prices. The best elementary school in Pinellas County is Palm Harbor Elementary, $6,500 per student. The 5 worst elementary schools in the state of Florida, $11,500 per student. So obviously, right off the bat, that's more money than the teachers union or anybody had ever wanted to spend per pupil. That would put us, at New York levels. So money was not the problem. Those 5 schools have the highest rate of fatherlessness of any schools in the state. And I brought that up, and I have an African-American legislator I work with, and we were attacked as being racist. So 2 years later, we need mentors. That was the whole purpose. You got to identify the problem. Highest rate of fatherlessness, and they weren't all African-Americans, they were Hispanics and whites, but they had no fathers. They were all single-parent homes. We were spending almost twice as much money per kid, and we were getting the worst results of any elementary schools in the state of Florida. So you can't spend your way out of this. You've got to have a foundation, and you got to look at families and get the community involved if you're going to fix these problems.
So Barry, what do you do if the father leaves?
Well, that's as a community, first of all, there's incentive.
Yeah.
We've had positions and I think that Bill Moyers, I was on a panel with him in D.C. once, and he'll admit they had programs that incentivized the split up of families, where if the father wasn't there, they got more money. And so that created problems with fatherlessness. But if we know that there's a problem with fatherlessness or single parents, then what Britt Baker did when he was mayor is he got adopted schools and he got businesses to come in and provide mentors.
Right.
And we know with Big Brothers Big Sisters, if you have an hour and a half per week with one of these kids,
Change their life.
it can change their life. We're talking about monumentally fact-based Pew studies, Harvard studies, liberal studies, conservative, an hour and a half for somebody like you and me to go sit with this kid and tell him that there's a better life and tell him how to provide structure.
Model it
Things
for
like
them. You're modeling. I taught 7th grade geography in Tyrone Middle for a year, okay, which is a Title I school. When I got out of college, I was 22 years old. It was my second teaching job. I was the only college graduate those kids knew. And those kids were told the only measure of success was a 4-year degree. And for some, it would be and could be. But think about that. That's no different than if you've never seen the ocean and you walked up to it and somebody said, go for a swim. You'd look at that person like they were crazy. That is no different than telling a 12-year-old, you're going to go to college someday. No, they're not. No, they're not. Not without a lot of intervention, to Rob's point. They're not. And we get away from this. And this is a social conversation, but wherever there is money, there will be fraud and waste. It doesn't matter if it's in tax cheats with billion-dollar companies or welfare. Wherever there is money, there will be fraud and waste. Book it. And it's no different than we incentivized the breakup of the family through welfare. Does that mean everybody on welfare is committed to that desire? Absolutely not. It exists as a social safety net for the vast majority of people. It should absolutely be there. But it absolutely does incentivize a perverse nature to have children out of wedlock. It absolutely does. Every study shows it. We know it to be the case.
Okay, but the welfare system is one of the things in this country that needs to be totally repaired.
Right.
Because not only does it do that, it has become, because there have been no limits for so long, that's the family business. We need to take these people and help them and give them a hand up and lift them out and put them to work and make them have the ethics and the pride and the morals that they need to have, because they get up and they go to work every day and they pay their bills and they take care of their children and they raise their children and they love their children because they become successful. When we just keep giving them money and food and housing and more, and the bigger their family gets, the more we give them, we're encouraging this behavior.
We came up with
completely and totally.
a program. Senator Rasan, who represents this area, and I did 50-50-50 his first year in office. We got 50 jobs for 50 kids and 50 mentors. And we met with all of them. And some of these was their first job, the summer job. Some, I remember 2 kids who got fired, and I thought, what a bad experience. And they told me it was the best experience in their life. They worked at the Rays games, and they liked the Rays. Well, they didn't want to sell. They were supposed to sell cotton candy and
They want to watch the game.
But they got fired. And they said that for the first time they learned accountability and responsibility.
We don't fail anymore.
And it changed their whole outlook on life. And none of those kids got arrested.
Look, we don't even win baseball and football games anymore. How are we going to fail?
Yeah, and I
And we
don't
get
want to.
participation trophies. What is with that?
I want to say this. I had a great professor, and I'm sorry, Sam. I had a great professor, and he was a doctor of education at the University of Florida. I majored in him, is what my advisor said. You're majoring in Shankman. I said, no kidding, he's wonderful. And he said this, he used this example. He said, back when I was here as a student at the University of Florida, if you cheated or got caught cheating, your name went on a board. There was no tribunal. There was no hearing. If it was proved that you had cheated, you were shamed and you left college. That would never happen today. Never. Do I want people to be shamed? No. But do I think an ounce of shame is sometimes good when we mess up? Absolutely. My business partner and best friend committed a white-collar crime and spent 18 months in prison. Paid his dues. I never would have stuck by him if he hadn't admitted to it, copped to it, came clean, served his sentence, never tried to get out of it, took his lumps, went there, served his time, humbled himself, rebuilt his life. Does that happen for everybody? Is it like that story all the time? No. But it starts small. It starts small. We're never going to break this cycle. We're never going to do it unless we start small and start realizing that it's okay to fail. Shame is not a terrible thing because we also have grace in this country. Because people love the story of the comeback. So I think that if we focus that as Americans more on the small things, all this big stuff that we worry about, we fight about, starts to take care of itself.
Yeah, but, it's as if we're the only country in the world. It's as if there's no lessons to be learned from any other country. I was trying to do an Annie Hall moment where I could find the numbers on welfare and family breakup, and that's why I was looking at my phone. I couldn't find it.
He was
But
looking at the Rays score, don't let him lie to you.
But you remember where Annie Hall, that they're arguing about movies and communication, Woody Allen and Annie are arguing, and then Woody reaches behind the pillar, and, there's a guy who pretends he knows all about Marshall McLuhan in front of them. And Woody pulls Marshall McLuhan out from behind a pillar and says, talk to this guy. And Marshall McLuhan said to the guy who was arguing about communications, you don't have a clue about what I'm telling you about. So I was hoping to get that moment here, and I didn't. But there are ways that other countries have solved the problems that we think about. So do you remember when Jeff Daniels did the TV show a few years ago about news reporting? And he had that opening statement. He was in a class, and kids were saying that America's number one. And Daniels went through a list of things where the U.S. is not number one. Other countries have figured out how to solve these very problems. And I'm not saying the family's not important. I agree 100%. I'll top Nick. I came from a family of 10 kids, and I'm the oldest. And I think family is important, and I love my family. But not everybody has the benefit of that experience. If you go to other countries that are smart and developed, they have better education outcomes, they have less child poverty, they have longer longevity, they have better health care for seniors, they outlive us, they have safer streets, they have less crime, because they've, Nick talks about not wanting to pay taxes. If you pay a few more taxes and you target that money towards solving the social problems, does everybody know about the F-35 bomber? You know about this? The F-35 bomber is this new bomber that we're building and we're testing out right now in the Panhandle. It doesn't fly in thunderstorms. It costs about $750.
It flies, but you can see it. It loses its stealth capability.
It costs about $750 million per plane. We talk about welfare. Some of the wealthiest people in this country are military contractors who get these contracts to build things that we don't really need. President Trump wants to build more aircraft carriers. We don't even have the young people to staff the current carriers that we have. We don't have the staff. He wants to build more submarines. We don't have the young people to staff that. So when we think about other countries, we shouldn't always say America's number one, because if you look at homelessness, I was in London and Paris about 10 years ago. I didn't see homeless people. Now, how can London, a big city, how can Paris, a big city, solve the homeless problem? We've got a homeless problem right here. Driving here on the corner, 2 miles from here, there was a guy panhandling. So I think that we shouldn't be so sure of ourselves that we've solved every problem or we've got answers to every problem. Sometimes we can look outside our country and see if people have solved the child abuse problem or see if people have solved the healthcare problem. And we should be willing, as a country, humble enough to say, yeah, maybe Sweden or Denmark has the answer. And I don't think we're humble enough yet. And I think we waste an incredible amount of money on things that we don't need.
I think there's a split.
I'm going to have to interject because this lady has been very patient in the back.
Okay.
And we have another question.
Europe, and exactly that, education, poverty. But my husband carries in his phone the clip of that piece from Newsroom, and he'll show it to anybody who will watch it, because that's exactly right. But my question is, there is one issue in this election. Would you agree that offering free college education would help the situation that you're talking about, those young students, to incentivize them to go on to college?
Free college tuition for everyone, or are we creating a standard?
No, for everyone.
No matter what? No
Yes.
standard? No standard.
As long as they have the grades.
So there is a standard.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I just want to be clear.
Yes.
Because, I want to be really clear about this. So I'm actually of the ilk, as a third-generation educator, college-educated myself, graduate school. I don't think college is for everybody. I think we send a terrible message. Can I just maybe rephrase and say, education beyond high school? Can it be, I mean, I'm asking sincerely, I want to know, can it be vocational, can it be apprenticeship, can it be certifications? It doesn't have to be just college. I think college is really poor job training. I think college should exist for a very specific sort of liberal arts grade, or if you're in a very specific mindset. But I think we are selling our kids a really terrible bill of goods. We're telling them that success is a 4-year degree by which you have to go into debt for and come out poorly trained, and all anybody ever cares about is your work experience. Does that mean college is bad? Absolutely not. But there are two things right now in this country that are completely unsustainable: cost of college and education, cost of healthcare. And it doesn't mean that I have all the answers for them. That's just the way it is. They are triple-digit increases year over year for the past 25 years. How is that possible? How do we get our hands around it? So what I would say is, do I think we should have a robust safety net, or some sort of free college or free post-secondary, whatever it may be? I'm all for that. But I would have a huge caveat that it is not the system we see today. And I am an acolyte of disruption, that I think we have so much information but so little common sense and ability by which to contextualize the history that is at our fingertips. I would like to see us give a broad look at how we can diffuse and bring down the cost of education, but also what are employers looking for? What do careers look like? What are we telling our kids? You will talk about other countries. They spend significant amounts of money in China, in Japan, and in the Asian countries giving diagnostic tests, and they brag about it. And they say, by the age 7, with 92% accuracy, we can tell you what that kid's going to be within a range. I don't necessarily adhere to that, but I think the point that they are putting out there is they let people self-select into their preferences for their educational purposes. And I think that's a good thing we should do in this country. We look down at our noses about guys, I call them Chuck in a truck, the guys who've got the work truck out front, and they own their own small business, they're doing their own invoicing, and they learn themselves, or they maybe went to an apprentice school. I want to see that push. I want to see college push, and I want to see everything in between push. And I want us to tell our kids, you want to be successful and have a great life? You don't have to go to college, but you got to do something after the 4 years of high school. It can't just be fall out of high school, oh, you didn't get into college, tough tarts, I guess you're going to go to, you sort of serve up any type of other post-high school education as not good enough or successful. Bull-larky. I look at that and say, you got to go to anything after. I would wholly support. I would love that funding.
Could you tell us what Germany does for training workers who decide not to go to college?
Secondary education schools where you can learn a trade. You can go into the arts. You can go to art school for several years.
And they're
you can
free,
earn a
right?
degree there. And you can get a master's degree free. But what you were mentioning, though, is yes, maybe college isn't for everybody, but those people that don't go to college, are they going to be earning $15 an hour and making a living wage?
More than that.
At this point, the trades are making more than
Way more.
most of the college graduates in this country. And I mean, I have 3 daughters that just finished college, and I know what that burden is. So, and I will tell you that a lot of their friends can't find jobs with their college degrees, particularly in this economy today. But when you look at the trades, the plumbers, the guys that are selling air conditioners and installing them, electricians, those people are making more money than $15 an hour, I can tell you, a lot more. And they're also making more than a lot of the kids that have been out of college for 3 and 4 years. And they don't have $150,000 in debt like most of the college students coming out of college today.
Yes, and I would endorse that, and I think it's great, and you couldn't get me there fast enough to make our kids. They should rush out of high school and go, the world is my oyster, and I'm going to learn something that's going to make me a productive citizen, not the $15 an hour wage. I'm talking the guys that I went to high school with, the ones who didn't go to college, maybe they went to a little bit of junior college, learned a trade. Well, by the time I got done setting my family and that, I'm in debt. They got bigger houses than me. They didn't get a 4-year degree. They're doing so much better than I was, and they got kids, and they got boats, and they take vacations, and they say, this was great. And you know what? I want more of that for our young people.
I just left a former NFL football player who went to college at a great university, graduated, and I did a film video for one of Nick's clients that he'll be getting tonight. He has a college degree, and he was high profile. He made $8 million in the NFL, spent it all. We got him because I took one of his friends, Robert Blackman, to meet the AFL-CIO, and he's all into the apprentice program. We have this football player now is a welder, and he's going on a job. He's making $60 an hour, doing whatever. So he's happy as a clam. He's not utilizing anything of the football from the college, but he's a welder, and he can go anywhere in the country.
I think one of the bigger problems is the education we're giving them before they get out of high school. These kids don't learn how to balance a checkbook, how to run a household, how to do any of the practical skills. There's no home ec anymore. There's no sewing classes. There's no shop classes anymore. They don't learn any of that. So they've never been exposed to any of that. We also need to educate them in all the career possibilities. And whether it's a doctor, a dentist, a lawyer, a welder, an electrician, a plumber, all the opportunities that are available to them, and we fail our students by not doing that.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess I was really addressing those kids who do want to go to college and just cannot because of affordability. It's just never going to happen for them.
How has
Those
college
are the
gotten
kids.
so expensive is the question, okay? The difference when I went to college and when my kids went to college is insane. And I know, I have a good friend who writes college textbooks. Do you know what they charge kids for textbooks? You pay hundreds of dollars for a textbook. It's ridiculous. And I said to her one day, why are they so flippin' expensive? She said, it's the pictures. And I said, don't put any pictures in them. She goes, they won't read them. Kids today won't read them without the pictures. We have to pay so much money to put the pictures in the textbooks. That's what makes them expensive. This is insane. It's great.
This is our 2-minute warning.
You know what? If you want to look at the first places to cut in university education, go look at the amount of staff right now. I did this with my good friend Senator Brandis and looked at. It is unbelievable the amount of non-instructional 6-figure salaries that exist at major universities. I mean, you've got layer upon layer. They don't fix problems. We just add another person. We just hire somebody new. We just layer over that person. We don't want to fire that person. We just layer over that person. We need a new diversity studies. Just layer over that person. It is out of control. It's unsustainable, and things that are unsustainable tend to stop, and they're gonna stop whether we fix them or not. Higher education in this country is a ticking time bomb of debt and poor outcomes, not for everybody, but it has ballooned to the point where it's unsustainable. And healthcare that Rob mentioned is unsustainable.
Barry's going to get the last word.
So I want to kind of defend. Some people, I like everything everybody said. These are my friends. America's healthcare system is so complex because America saved civilization. In the 1940s, we saved the world. Europe started from scratch. Our healthcare system is a product of, because we had a president that I think was one of the top 3 of all time, Franklin Roosevelt, capped wages. And so the only way you could compete for labor was to add benefits, and benefits for healthcare weren't taxed. And so our healthcare system developed differently than Europe, which started in rubble. And so when we look at those, I think it's a false comparison, because then we developed a whole finance system that they didn't have. So if we went to single payer, things like that, we can't factor in things like that. So it's much more complex. But also, we look at these European countries, and I actually interviewed an Oxford scholar from Sweden, and he was a member of the Liberal Parliament. And he said, you know, his country, when it got to 15% non-blonde, blue-eyed Swedes, all of a sudden, we don't want any more immigrants. The most liberal party there has capped immigration. And they're revolting against their safety net because these immigrants cost more money. So a lot of these countries that we talk about in Europe are very homogenous, but they're small. America's the 3rd highest population in the world, 340 million people. These other countries have the economies of Pinellas County and the populations of Tampa Bay. I think it's a false comparison, and like we saw in Sweden, as soon as they got to 1 out of 8 non-homogenous people, they started to have problems. And they have problems, and they're shipping Syrians back home. You're Syrian, you get $30,000 to go start your own business. But the fact is, every single party in Sweden now doesn't want more immigrants, the most liberal and the most conservative. And the Liberal Party policy is what it was, the Conservative Party was 20 years ago.
That is the conclusion to what I think has been
Go America!
really, really fascinating evening. So
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
So that does conclude our program. Many thanks to this really wonderful panel. I have done a lot of moderating in my day, and this was a fabulous panel. Barry Edwards, Rob Laurie, April Schiff, and Nick Hansen. And thank you to the audience who came out tonight. It was very brave of you, and we really appreciated you being here. Great questions. And thank you very much to our audience that has been with us virtually from around the country. If you enjoyed this evening, I hope you'll consider leaving a little something in the donation fireman's boot at the back table as you leave. And thank you all very much. We look forward to seeing you again, and please go vote. Drive safe.
I'll call you when I get in the car.
Unless it's for the other guy. Then don't vote.
What's that?
Unless it's